Hi, in this video, I want to talk about how to do a word study in the Hebrew Bible. Now, when I was in high school in the ninth grade, I had a great teacher, Mrs. Goss, and she said, if you can't define a word, you don't know what it means. And at the time I thought, wow, that is so profound. Of course, she was wrong because she had this fallacious view, as we'll talk a little bit about later in this video, that meaning is somehow in the words. But meaning is not in words. Words take on meanings in context, in sentences, and so I can give you a abstract definition for a word, but what I'm doing when I'm giving you an abstract definition for a word is I'm trying to picture a way that the word is used. And the meaning of a word basically is a popularity contest. The meaning of a word is how the word is being used at any particular time and place, and we can rank them. And the number one way that this word is being used is, and that's the number one meaning. But it changes. It's not fixed. You as time goes by, the meaning of words drops out of use. Eventually, they'll put it under the last definition as archaic. And then eventually, it's so irrelevant that they don't even list it in the dictionary. Meanwhile, new meanings are always popping up. These aren't plans. It's not part of some scheme somewhere to change the English language or whatever language. People talk, and idioms arise, and new uses arise, and bam, you've got it. There are words in the dictionary every year that are added. They decide, what word are we going to add into the dictionary? So, doing a word study is really looking at all the different places. Let me go ahead and tell you, it's basically a method for determining the range of meanings. It's not just, most words don't have just one meaning. They have a range of meanings. And these aren't necessarily related to each other. A range of meanings a word can have at a particular time and place. And of course, if you're doing a word study in the Bible, you probably want to know, well, what does it mean in this verse? And so you establish what the range of meaning of the word is, and then you lock phasers, lock fotan torpedoes, on particular meaning that the word seems to have in a context. Sometimes it's not clear. If you're looking for definitiveness in these sorts of things, it's you're deceiving yourself a lot if you think that you can always have definitiveness on these sorts of things. Well, here is a method for doing a word or phrase study, especially in the Hebrew Bible, although it applies to any language. It applies to the New Testament and Greek, etc. First of all, I would suggest for practical reasons that you pick a good word. You're usually trying to say, what does this word mean in this context? Now, you can do a word study on anything. I'm sure that there's a doctoral dissertation on the word and in Hebrew, which is just, the wow at the beginning of a word, or the vav, depending on what you call it. I'm sure there's a dissertation somewhere that's done that, and more power to them. When I say pick a good word, I mean a word that it's going to be useful and worth your while. I had a student once who wanted to do a word study on a Greek word that meant impossible, and I suggest that probably wasn't a good word because it means not possible. This is a confusion that we have. We mistake the context and the meaning that a whole bunch of words are getting at with it coming from one word. It doesn't come from the one word. So the passage that this student was interested in was in Hebrews, where it says it's impossible for God to lie. And what he really wanted to know is, what does that mean? What does it mean for something not to be possible for God? But you see, that's not that doesn't have anything to do with the word impossible. Well, it has something to do with it. But it doesn't come from the word impossible. It comes from the question of God. It's the context. It's the topic that is fascinating. What would it mean for something to be impossible for God? But the word impossible simply means not possible. It's not a good word to do a word study on. The word blue, I don't know, does the word blue appear in the Old Testament? I'm not sure it does, but probably it's not gonna, unless blue somehow has a strange. Now, when they were those Samaritans, they used the word blue to refer to a peacock, or whatever. You get these surprises. But pick a good word. Like if picking a word that appears 5,000 times in the New Testament or Old Testament, probably not a great word unless you have an infinite amount of time and somebody's paying you. So when I say pick a good word, pick a word that's going to probably have some flexibility of meaning. And that is in it's bite-sized. You can handle it. 50 times that's a lot of work, but it only appears 50 times in the Old Testament. So pick a good word. That's just advice. Look up the basic meaning of the word to get started. 1 to 3. You can even skip this step. Let me show you. I'm going to engage a little bit with Blue Letter Bible and interlinearbible.org in this video just to show you how you can get some of these things there. So let me show you how you get the basic meaning of a word in each of those cases. So here I am in interlinearbible.org or biblehub.com/interlinear. And I've shown you this before previously. So let's say I want to know, and the earth was formless and void. So let's say I want to know what tohu, there's transliteration. What does tohu mean? So this is called the Strong's number. And of course, the E stands for Englishman's Concordance. So for example, I can go to the Strong's number, and here it's telling me it's tohu, and I've got some basic definitions. I want you to sit lightly to these. Students, they have a real tendency to just become like this is the word of God as to what this means. I've hit pig, or this can be wrong. This was Strong's. He was a smart guy. This was the 1800s. But don't be a slave to it, because we're going to make you a scholar, and you can decide for yourself what you think the word means. Here's if you'd have hit the E, you would have gotten in its own dedicated form, Englishman's Concordance. This is going to be useful because this is telling you all the places where tohu is used in the Old Testament. Turns out not to be a whole lot. Well, actually, there's several places there. 20 occurrences of tohu. Tohu vavohu doesn't, as a phrase, formless and void, that only appears a few places. Tohu appears more than vohu, I think. Let me go back to this and look at vohu. Come on, you can do it. Okay, so we looked at tohu. Now let's look at vavohu. Vohu is void or whatever. Let me hit the Englishman so you can see what it looks like if you hit the E. So here is vohu, and it doesn't give you so much a definition if you hit the Englishman's, but here it will tell you all the places. So this one, vohu, only appears 3 times. And each time it's with tohu. So Jeremiah 4:3, tohu vavohu. Isaiah 34, it's just vohu. Oh no, tohu's here too. So tohu vavohu, it was a thing. If I had clicked on the Strong's number of vohu, it would have taken me here, and then emptiness is what it suggests the meaning is. But don't in any way, please, don't stress me out. Don't treat whatever Strong says as this is the word of the Lord. It means this. That's why we're doing a word study, so that you can find out what it means. So here I am at Blue Letter Bible. And again, I've shown you how to get here before. Pull that up, and I go down here to find there's tohu, see tohu, and bohu. They've left the H out for whatever reason. Again, don't treat these tools as inerrant, because they're good and they're helpful, but they're not perfect. Let me hit on vohu. By the way, vohu only appears 3 times in the Old Testament. What that means is we really don't have a big enough sample to know for sure what this thing means. So again, it's saying void, emptiness. The King James translates it void and emptiness. Here's an outline, emptiness. Please, I beg of you, don't treat this information as the Word of God. So Brown Driver Briggs is Brown Driver Briggs is a very reputable Hebrew dictionary. So you can treat Brown Driver Briggs with a little bit more seriousness than, say, Gesenius. Gesenius was a very smart guy, but please don't treat his as the word of the Lord. The same thing, outline of biblical usage. Please do not treat it as the word of the Lord. I want you to do your own generation of it. There are 3 places. So again, it's going to be hard for us to know for sure exactly what. We just don't know. I know that's an unpleasing answer, but we just don't know definitively what vohu means. We just don't know. And so anyway, it's worth looking at. It doesn't take a lot of time because there are only 3 instances. Tohu is more helpful because you remember we had almost a whole page of what tohu. We certainly get a feel for it, right? We got a feel for it. It's like chaos. These are chaos words. It's messy. Everything's messy. This place is schmutzy. Where's the broom? So we get some impression of it, but it's hard to know for sure what bohu actually meant. Okay, back to the slide. So the idea again, you just get a general sense of what the word means. Next, we are going to try to find a place of where all the word and phrase is used in the Old Testament. And I've just shown you how to do that, right? I've just shown you how to find that in Blue Letter Bible and how to find that in interlinearbible.org. Feel free to rewind this video and go back and see how I found them. Maybe I should show you. I don't know. Should I show you? Nah, I decided not to. I've already shown you. Okay, so that's how you go about it. Now, then you go through all the places where the word is used in the Old Testament. Now, it needs to be a Hebrew word, not an English word. Why? Because English words have an English range of meaning. Hebrew words have a Hebrew range of meaning. It's not the same. Languages aren't simply, well, let me find the word in this language that corresponds to the word in this language. It doesn't map like that. There are words in the English Bible that translate more than one. You may have the same English word in your English Bible translating more than one Hebrew word. And the same Hebrew word may be translated by more than one English word. And your first reaction might be like, well, that's awful. We need to make it right. But that is right. That's the way language works. You see, languages just don't do things the same way, and they don't mean the same things. We have this kind of, I don't know what you do, but it's easy to have this naive sense that, well, words mean the same in every language. They don't. And in fact, the meaning of the Hebrew Bible is locked in the ancient world. These words weren't written for the 21st century. They were written in ancient Israel. And that changes everything. It means that I'm going to say it, I'm sorry, it's not popular, but it's just the way it is. You cannot understand the Old Testament unless you know the Old Testament world. And these Hebrew words are locked up in the Old Testament world. They weren't, just like our words are locked up in our world today. And you can't understand these English words unless my wife is a middle school teacher. And let me say, they have a whole different language. It's changing every year. And she's like, well, I don't know what that means. Well, I don't know what that means. That's the way language is. We are deceiving ourselves if we think we understand the Bible simply because we have a nice English translation. So we're going to approach this word study in layers of context. What do I mean by that? Well, that means I'm going to start with occurrences in the book itself. Because remember, the Old Testament was written over a period of hundreds and hundreds of years. Some would say 1,000 years. Well, you can imagine that we have a hard time even understanding the King James Version, which its last revision was, some 200 plus years ago. And so you can imagine that when you have hundreds and hundreds of years of change over the period of the Old Testament being written, that the words are going to change meaning. They just are. And so let's start local with, like, if we're looking at the word hesed and we're looking at a particular passage in Isaiah, then let's start with the book of Isaiah, and let's branch out. Start with the occurrences in an individual book. Then look if there are other books by the same author. You look for how the word or phrase is used in other books by the same author. By the way, this gets very complicated when you start studying advanced Old Testament studies because there are all kinds of questions about some of these things. Then look at the occurrences in the rest of the Old Testament. Now, because sometimes, like we saw the word bohu, it's used so rarely in the Old Testament that we may have to go to some what are called cognate languages. These are like Ugaritic is from Ugarit, which predates the Old Testament, but it is a related language. Akkadian is a related language from Babylonia, ancient Babylonia. So we have to be very careful, but these other languages can help us. They're better than nothing. But as we'll say in a second, I'm going to call something a wrong language fallacy. Beware. Words don't mean the same thing in the same language. necessarily. So you know that they're not necessarily going to mean the same thing across different languages. Nevertheless, it can help. So how are we going to do it after? So we've gone through all the instances where the word is used, and while maybe you might consider resources at this point, but again, you can be as good a scholar. Some of these scholarly, especially from the mid 20th century, Kittle's Theological Dictionary is riddled with fallacies. It's not a total loss, but that 10-volume massive work is, a lot of it was based upon faulty understanding of language. Anyway, I had my parents buy me a Kittle's Theological Dictionary. This is New Testament words for Christmas one day. I still have the set, but anyway, beware, because you can be a better scholar than Gerhard Kittel, who was a Nazi, by the way. So who cares? Who cares about Kittel? Is what I'm saying. I care that he was a Nazi, but anyway, create a dictionary entry. This is your popularity, and the number one way that this word is being used is, and the number 2 way, and the number 3 way. Just count them up. Well, it looks like it means this in these instances. The word kesed has an overwhelmingly positive meaning. I haven't done a formal word study because it appears a lot of times in the Old Testament. But most of the time it means something like faithfulness or loving kindness, which are slightly different meanings that you might have different entries for them. But it has this one use in Leviticus where it means a disgrace. And it's like, what's going on here? Well, words are funny. But that would be the last definition, because it's only one time in the whole Old Testament that kesed means a disgrace. So create a dictionary, the popularity context, first, second, third, etc. Now, if you're interpreting a particular passage, then you go back to the passage and you say, well, I think it's this meaning in this context. Sometimes you can't tell exactly what's going on. Like if it's in a list, Paul has some virtue lists in the New Testament where he just mentions a word. You know it's a positive, or if it's a vice list, it's a negative, but it's hard because you don't have enough context to know exactly what he's referring to necessarily. Okay, I want to end this video with some word fallacies. And I've kind of been addressing them indirectly as we've gone through, but let me just kind of systematize a list here. First of all, wrong language fallacy. Just because a word means something in Aramaic or in Ugaritic or in Akkadian or in Babylonian, just because a word means something in one related language, Arabic is related to Hebrew, just because it's in a related, that doesn't mean it's necessarily the right meaning. But you might get a sense of you might get some hints as to what it means, but wrong language fallacy. Etymological fallacy, I call this in my writing that goes along with this video, the chapter that's the written chapter that goes along with this. I call it the what it meant historically fallacy, or something like that. What a word meant in the past doesn't necessarily map to what it means now. I mean, you hear this all the time in the New Testament, ecclesia, the called out ones. Nobody thought about that. That's any more than I think about understand. I'm standing under the concept. That's stupid, really. The etymological fallacy. The history of a word. Homer talks about an arrow missing the mark. So that's what sin is, to miss the mark. Survey says. Historical fallacy, etymological fallacy. History of a word doesn't necessarily mean anything in terms of what the word means today. You're going to have to do the hard work of a word study to see, well, what does the word seem to mean here? Anachronism. What a word later means doesn't necessarily mean what it meant there. So the word shibboleth today, it comes from Judges. And today we say, well, if you can't say a shibboleth, if you can't say the word inerrancy, we're not going to hire you. So, for example, a shibboleth. But that doesn't tell you what it meant at the time of Judges. At the time of Judges, I don't know what shibboleth meant. It was just a hard thing for certain people to say because they said thibboleth, and so it was a way for, I think it's Gideon, or to find out whether these people are the right people or the wrong people. But just because it means shibboleth today doesn't mean that's what it meant back then, because words change meaning over time. The root fallacy. There isn't just some core meaning that appears every time a word happens. That's the root fallacy, or the lexical fallacy. There isn't a core meaning that goes in every use of the word. Again, that's assuming words are the way they are used. And words change meaning. There isn't a common ground that goes with every time the word is used. That's just not true. It's not what happens. The overload fallacy, that's where you put a whole bunch of theology into a word. Well, that's not true. It's the topic that is rich. So like take the word shalom. Shalom means something like peace. That's the easy one. It can mean not to be distressed, and that kind of thing. Well, there are a lot of people that talk about God's shalom, and it's a very rich concept, and it's right. I'm not dissing the idea of shalom as a lot of people use it, but let me tell you, that's not in the word. It's in a theological concept that we've built around the word. The word itself has a very limited meaning when it's used in a context. It means, you can go to your death in peace. Simply means you can go to your death without great tension and turmoil, something like that. It's something very basic. It doesn't mean you can go to your death in complete wholeness of person in which you're in proper relationship with God and man. I mean, that's just overload. Words don't do that. We treat words like they're these magical jack-in-the-boxes of theology. Out pops some theology. But the topic is rich. But it's not in the word exactly. Words usually only mean something very limited each time they're used, to where you could almost say, well, in this passage it means this synonym, this one-word synonym. And that's called the overload fallacy, where you just put one way of doing it is you take all the meanings that a word can have in every place, and you see them every place the word is used. This word means all these things at the same time. No, it doesn't. It means one thing at the same time. There are things like double entendres, like, oh, look, there's a goose. He's chasing a goose. He's doing a wild goose chase. And you're like, ha, 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 because it's a double entendre. He is literally chasing a goose, and there's that expression, a wild goose chase. Double entendres are frankly about as much as our brains can handle. And yet people regularly kind of like, well, in this passage, this word means this. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. You have a beautiful mind. You can write a book about all those uses of the word. You can build a theology out of all those uses of a word. But in any one use of a word, it usually just means one very narrow thing. I'm sorry, I'm a party pooper, but truth really doesn't care. Okay, one meaning fallacy. There's some people like, you should translate this word one way, every place. I had a student came to me once and said, hey, this version claims to always use the same translation. It's a better translation of John because it always uses the same word to translate the same word. And I'm like, bad translation. I don't even need to look at it, because words don't do that. Words have a range of meanings. They don't have just one meaning every place they're used. Word concept fallacy. If the word's not there, the concept's not there. The book of Esther doesn't mention God. The author of Esther didn't believe in God. Just because a specific word isn't there doesn't mean the concept isn't there. I mean, after all, a definition of a word doesn't have the word in it, right? So a word doesn't have to be there for the concept to be there. It's not a one-to-one map of word equals concept. Well, this has been a lot, but basically I've been talking about how to do a word study in the Hebrew Bible. And I hope you've learned a little bit about the philosophy of language as well, a topic that I am very interested in. All right, well, onward.